What if one of the greatest acts of forgetting in human history happened in America, long before the United States existed, before Jamestown, before Columbus, before the Atlantic slave trade reshaped continents? North America was already home to ancient civilizations of staggering complexity. There were cities with pyramids and plazas, trade routes stretching hundreds of miles, farmers who reshaped rivers, forests, and entire landscapes, priests, rulers, astronomers, engineers, merchants, and artists all lived here, not in scattered isolation, but in organized societies with deep traditions and long memories. And yet, for many people today, these civilizations barely exist in popular memory. When most imagine ancient civilization, they think of Egypt, Rome, Greece, maybe the Maya or the Aztec. But in the lands that would one day become the United States, enormous societies rose, flourished, and vanished from common understanding. Their earthworks were dismissed as natural hills. Their cities were mistaken for wilderness. Their descendants were pushed aside, while their past was buried under conquest, myth, and silence. So how does an entire continent forget its first civilizations? This is the story of memory erased, not because nothing was there, but because too much was. To understand why America forgot its first civilizations, we must begin with one basic truth. This continent was never empty. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples across North America built societies adapted to deserts, forests, coastlines, prairies, and river valleys. Some lived in mobile communities, moving with seasons and animal migrations. Others built permanent towns, ceremonial centers, and large urban settlements. These ways of life were not stages on a ladder from primitive to advanced. They were different answers to the same human challenge: how to live, organize, believe, and endure. In the eastern woodlands, along the Mississippi and Ohio river systems, societies emerged that could mobilize vast labor forces and transform the land itself. They built massive earthen mounds for ceremony, burial, politics, and power. They aligned structures with celestial events. They cultivated crops at scale and sustained large populations. At places like Poverty Point, Hopewell Centers, Moundville, Etowah, and above all Cahokia, they demonstrated a level of coordination and complexity that shattered later myths of an untouched wilderness. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was perhaps the most dramatic example. At its height around the 11th and 12th centuries, it was larger than many European cities of the same era. Its great central mound still towers over the floodplain, evidence of organized labor on a monumental scale. Around it spread plazas, neighborhoods, ritual spaces, and satellite communities. This was not an isolated village. It was a true center of civilization, and Cahokia was not alone. Across the continent, from Chaco Canyon in the southwest to the Mississippian centers of the southeast, societies developed rich political and spiritual worlds. North America before European arrival was not a blank page. It was a library, vast, layered, and alive. The tragedy is not that these civilizations disappeared completely. The tragedy is that later America chose not to read what remained. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not enter an empty land. They entered a world already inhabited, named, cultivated, governed, and remembered by others. But European empires had their own needs. They needed land, they needed resources, they needed moral justification. And so, from the very beginning, colonization was tied to a powerful idea that the people already here were not fully using the land, not truly civilizing it, not possessing it in ways Europeans were willing to respect. This idea was false, but it was useful. Even before many settlers reached the interior, disease had already begun to devastate indigenous populations. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other epidemics spread ahead of conquest, shattering communities that had no immunity to Afro-Eurasian diseases. Entire towns weakened or disappeared. Political orders were disrupted. Oral traditions were broken as elders died. Trade networks faltered. Sacred sites were abandoned or transformed. Then came war, forced removal, enslavement, missionization, and relentless territorial expansion. By the time many Europeans or Euro-Americans encountered the great earthworks and abandoned sites of the interior, They often saw them without understanding the worlds that had created them. They were looking at ruins after demographic collapse, after political fracture, after cultural trauma, and instead of asking what had happened, many invented comforting myths. Some claimed that a vanished race, unrelated to native peoples, must have built the mounds. Others imagined lost tribes, wandering outsiders, or mysterious white builders. These fantasies all served one purpose: they separated indigenous peoples from the achievements of their own ancestors. If native nations had built cities, monuments, and regional civilizations, then they had history, sovereignty, and rightful inheritance. If someone else had built them, then the dispossession of native peoples became easier to excuse. Forgetting, in other words, was not an accident. It became a weapon. One of the strangest chapters in American historical memory was the invention of the so-called Mound Builders. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, settlers across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys encountered enormous earthworks, geometric embankments, burial mounds, and platform mounds. These structures were too large, too deliberate, and too numerous to ignore. Yet many Americans refused to believe that the native peoples they were displacing could have created them, so they imagined another civilization. According to these theories, the mounds had been built by a lost race that had vanished before the ancestors of living Native Americans arrived. Some said they were descendants of Israelites. Others claimed they were refugees from Atlantis, migrants from Europe, or a noble but extinct people conquered by savage tribes. The details changed, but the message was the same. Real civilization had existed here, but it was not native. This was pseudo-history dressed as curiosity. It spread because it comforted settlers. It allowed them to admire the monuments without respecting the people whose lands they were taking. Turned Native Americans into intruders in their own homeland. It transformed colonization into a kind of reclamation. The truth was simpler and far more powerful. The mounds were built by the ancestors of indigenous peoples of North America. They emerged from long local traditions of engineering, ceremony, kinship, and political authority. They were the products of civilizations that belonged fully to this continent. By the late 19th century, serious archaeology had begun to dismantle the mound builder myth. Scholars working with evidence rather than fantasy showed clearly that indigenous societies had built the mounds. But myths do not disappear just because facts arrive. They linger in textbooks, popular culture, local legends, and national habits of thought. Even after the lie was disproven, the damage remained. America had already trained itself to doubt native achievement. Every nation tells stories about itself. The United States is no exception. Its most familiar origin stories begin with European arrival, Columbus crossing the Atlantic, pilgrims at Plymouth, colonists at Jamestown, founders drafting constitutions, pioneers pushing westward. These stories are powerful not only because of what they include, but because of what they leave out. In many versions of American memory, indigenous peoples appear only at the edge of the frame. They are presented as obstacles, background figures, tragic victims, or symbols of nature, rarely as heirs to ancient civilizations with intellectual, political, and architectural traditions of their own. This selective memory served the project of nation building. A young republic expanding across a continent found it easier to imagine itself as creating civilization than as conquering older worlds. The myth of the frontier depended on emptiness. The myth of progress depended on replacement. The myth of American innocence depended on forgetting. Schoolbooks played a major role. For generations, children learned far more about Greece and Rome than about Cahokia or Chico. They learned that civilization came from Europe and that history advanced westward across the Atlantic. Ancient America, especially north of Mexico, was flattened into a vague prelude. But this was never just an educational oversight. It reflected power. What a nation teaches reveals what it wants to remember. What it refuses to teach reveals what it fears. To fully recognize America's first civilizations would mean admitting that conquest destroyed not a wilderness, but networks of societies with memory, law, ritual, diplomacy, and place-based knowledge. It would mean replacing the story of discovery with the story of interruption. That is a much harder story to tell. Part of the forgetting also came from the physical way America grew. Cities expanded, roads cut through ancient sites, Farms leveled mounds for plowing. Looters dug into graves and ceremonial centers. Museums filled with artifacts stripped from context. Suburbs, factories, and highways spread over landscapes once filled with meaning. In many places, the evidence of ancient civilization was not merely neglected, it was bulldozed. This destruction made forgetting easier. The less people could see, the less they imagined had ever been there. And yet the traces remain everywhere. A strangely shaped hill in a Midwestern town may be a mound. A flat field may once have been a plaza. A place name may preserve the echo of an older world. Beneath modern neighborhoods, parking lots, and farmland lie the remains of cities, towns, and sacred spaces that once linked communities across immense distances. Archaeology has recovered part of this story, but recovery is never complete. A looted grave cannot be restored to its original meaning. A leveled earthwork cannot fully speak again. And a people forced through removal, boarding schools, religious suppression, and centuries of erasure cannot simply be asked to hand back a perfect archive. Still, descendants remember more than many outsiders realize. Oral traditions, ceremonial practices, place-based histories, and community knowledge have preserved connections that colonial narratives tried to sever. The first civilizations of North America were not forgotten by everyone. They were forgotten, above all, by the institutions that claimed authority over the past. That distinction matters. To say America forgot its first civilizations does not mean those civilizations vanished without descendants. It means the dominant culture refused to recognize them. Native nations endured. They adapted, resisted, survived, and carried memory forward under crushing conditions. Languages persisted, stories persisted, ceremonies persisted, even where specific ancient cities declined centuries before European contact. The peoples of those regions did not become blank pages. History continued. This is one of the deepest misunderstandings in popular storytelling. The idea that a civilization is real only if its monuments remain intact and its political order survives unchanged. By that standard, much of human history would disappear. Civilizations transform, capitals fall, belief systems shift, populations migrate. But continuity can remain in kinship, memory, and cultural inheritance. That is true in North America as much as anywhere else. The problem was never absence. The problem was recognition. Modern scholarship has increasingly revealed how sophisticated these societies were, their agricultural systems, astronomical alignments, regional exchange networks, artistic traditions, ecological knowledge, and political strategies. But native communities have long known that their ancestors were not shadows in someone else's story. They were makers of worlds. And as more people listen, truly listen, the old myth of emptiness begins to crack. This is not only about correcting the past, it is about understanding the present. The way America forgot its first civilizations shaped land policy, education, identity, and law. It influenced which histories were funded, preserved, and honored. It shaped whose ancestors were seen as creators and whose were seen as disposable. Even now, debates over monuments, sacred sites, museum collections, and school curricula are really debates about memory, who gets to define the continent's past, and for what purpose. Remembering America's first civilizations does more than fill a gap in the record. It changes the frame entirely. It reminds us that complex societies do not belong to one part of the world, that cities rose here long before the modern United States, that environmental knowledge accumulated over millennia. That conquest did not begin history, it interrupted histories already underway. Most of all, it forces a moral question. What kind of nation inherits the landscapes of older civilizations, and then teaches its children to look away? Perhaps the answer is changing. Archaeologists, native scholars, communities, and educators are rebuilding parts of the story. Sites once ignored are being reinterpreted. Old myths are being challenged. The silence is no longer complete. But remembering is not passive. It requires effort, humility, and the willingness to let the land mean more than the myths built upon it. America did not forget its first civilizations because they were small, simple, or insignificant. It forgot them because remembering them would change everything. It would change how the continent is imagined, how its history begins, how its landscapes are read, how justice is understood. It would reveal that beneath the nation's most familiar stories lies another America, older, deeper, and far more complicated than the legend of an empty frontier. The first civilizations were never truly absent. They were buried under disease, conquest, myth, and denial. Their monuments were worn down. Their names were mispronounced. Their descendants were told to disappear, but the earth never fully surrendered the memory. The mounds still rise. The canyon walls still hold their shadows. The rivers still run past places once filled with ceremony, trade, and power. And now, slowly, the silence is breaking, because the real question is no longer whether America had first civilizations. The real question is why it took so long to admit that it did.